Hello, Year 9. Just to briefly introduce what we're doing, I'm sure that your class teachers will have all left you an explanation of how this is going. Hopefully one has been sent home to your parents as well. But we have sat down in English and we have redesigned this half term's topic, and we've redesigned it specifically for remote learning. We don't want you to feel like we are ignoring all of the feedback that you've given, and also we want to take everything that's worked so far and everything that we think is successful in terms of working from home, and apply it specifically to this half term's work. So we do really want to hear feedback. We want to know how we can improve it, and week on week we will make sure that we do that for you. So let us know if this works, how this works, and whether or not there's anything that we can do to improve it. Anyway, I'll crack straight on. So here's what you're going to need today. So you're going to need these things. You're going to need a piece of paper and a pen or a pencil. That's just to make your own notes. Nothing that you do on the paper will be marked or you will need to submit until a larger task, which I'll explain later on in the video. You also need to be able to pause the video, because what I'm going to do from time to time is tell you to use the next thing on the list there, which is the Google form. So I've made a Google form sort of answer sheet or worksheet, whatever you want to call it. You need to have that open in a different tab or on a different device, just so you can pause the video now and again and go into the answer sheet and type in your answers. The last one there is very true. You do need to have an open mind. We've all studied poetry, primary school, year 7, year 8 before, and I think it's important for you to really kind of come at it with a fresh pair of eyes and a fresh mind, which is obviously difficult in these current circumstances to kind of keep ourselves open and excited about things. But I really think this is a fantastic opportunity for you to look at poetry in a brand new and exciting way, and I'm sure that there's going to be stuff that we go through over the course of this video that is going to surprise you, or is going to make you think really hard about the parameters of poetry and what they really are. So this is the overall question that we're looking at today. This is our sort of big question, if you will. What is poetry? In order to answer what poetry is, there are also other questions that go alongside it, such as why do we study it? That's something else we're going to look at. What is the point of looking at it? What's the point of poetry in general, let alone studying it? What's the point of it? Are there any rules? Is there anything that makes something poetry, or that says, yes, this therefore is poetry, or this therefore is not poetry? And all of these questions kind of tie into one bigger question, which is, why do people write it? So I think actually answering what poetry is in a sense less important than trying to work out why people write it in the first place. You know, what's the point of it? Why do we study it? Are there rules? But who sits down and goes, I'm going to write a poem? And why do they choose a poem? Why do they choose poetry? Why is it a form that people feel is worthy of their time? Why is it a form that people feel able to communicate in? In order for us to kind of really get to grips with why people write poetry, the first thing we need to do is write down all the things that we would expect to find in a poem. First, we're going to look at kind of identifying a poem. You know, what is a poem, what isn't. So pause the video now, and on your piece of paper with your pen or pencil, write down all of the things that you would expect to find in a poem. Okay, so what I've made here is a list of things that you will probably end up with. A list of things that might well be on your list. They may not be. It might be that you have none of them. It might be that you have all of them. I created this list from all the years of teaching and kind of asking students this question. So these are the sort of common ones that come up. But there's a big one at the end that we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about. So rhyming. Quite often people immediately go, yes, rhyming, that's in poetry. There's a pattern that might be linked to the rhyming as well. A story, quite often there's a story. it might be abstract. It might have something abstract in it. Feelings. It might contain feelings. It might even be about feelings. There might be a narrator. There might be someone. There might be some character who's telling us this story or sharing their feelings. Long words. A lot of people write down, yeah, poetry's got a lot of long words. Don't really understand it. Don't know what's going on. Verses or stanzas. So it's kind of broken down sometimes into verses or stanzas, even if it's just one. Metaphors. Imagery, that obviously goes hand in hand with metaphors, and rhythm, along with rhyming and pattern, that idea of rhythm. But here's the sort of big one I want to talk about, something being designed to be a poem. So in a few minutes, we're going to watch a video that's a TED talk about what poetry is. But the thing that I always think in terms of the best way to kind of think about poetry, the best kind of analogy for you to decide whether or not you think something is a poem, and whether that idea of that kind of debate between, if someone tells you it's a poem, does that definitely mean that it is? The best analogy for that, the thing that it always reminds me of, is this chap. So this is Harry Potter. You may well have known that. Harry Potter, when he first arrives at Hogwarts, goes to this ceremony called the sorting ceremony, where he has to put on the sorting hat, and the sorting hat tells him which house he's going to be in, and it sort of looks into your deeper, innermost feelings and thoughts, and it decides what house you should be in based on your character. So Harry's sitting there, and he puts the hat on, and he puts it on, and he goes, "Oh no, I hope I'm not in Slytherin, I don't like it, no." And then the hat's in his head, and the hat says to him, "Oh, but Harry, you'd be so good in Slytherin, oh, you'd be fantastic, you'd be great." And he's like, "Oh no, leave it out, I don't like it, I don't want it, I don't want it." And the hat's like, "Oh, but you'd be so magnificent." And so it goes on and on like that for some time. And the key part of that analogy there is that Harry is desperate not to be in Slytherin. The hat's going, you're sort of quite suited to that, and really the hat ends up saying that actually wherever you want to be is the place that you ought to have been, because that tells you more about you than anything I can. Anyway, we're going to watch this TED talk now about what poetry is. And again, feel free to pause it and write down any ideas or thoughts that you have, because we're going to move on to a point where we're kind of making our own definitions of what poetry is. So this is a really, really good video, and I hope you enjoy it.
Muhammad Ali spent years training to become the greatest boxer the world had ever seen, but only moments to create the shortest poem. Ali captivated Harvard's graduating class in 1975 with his message of unity and friendship. When he finished, the audience wanted more. They wanted a poem. Ali delivered what is considered the shortest poem ever. Me, we. Or is it me, we? No one's really sure. Regardless, if these two words are a poem, then what exactly makes a poem a poem? Poets themselves have struggled with this question, often using metaphors to approximate a definition. Is a poem a little machine, a firework, an echo, a dream? Poetry generally has certain recognizable characteristics. 1. Poems emphasize language's musical qualities. This can be achieved through rhyme, rhythm, and meter, from the sonnets of Shakespeare to the odes of Confucius to the Sanskrit Vedas. 2. Poems use condensed language, like literature, with all the water wrung out of it. 3. Poems often feature intense feelings, from Rumi's spiritual poetry to Pablo Neruda's Ode to an Onion. Poetry, like art itself, has a way of challenging simple definitions. While the rhythmic patterns of the earliest poems were a way to remember stories even before the advent of writing, a poem doesn't need to be lyrical. Reinhard Doll's Apfel and Eugen Gomringer's Silencio toe the line between visual art and poetry. Meanwhile, E.E. Cummings wrote poems whose shapes were as important as the words themselves, in this case, amplifying the sad loneliness of a single leaf falling through space. If the visual nature of poetry faded into the background, perhaps we'd be left with music. And that's an area that people love to debate. Are songs poems? Many don't regard songwriters as poets in a literary sense, but lyrics from artists like Paul Simon, Bob Dylan, and Tupac Shakur often hold up even without the music. In rap, poetic elements like rhyme, rhythm, and imagery are inseparable from the form. Take this lyric from the Notorious B.I.G. I can hear sweat trickling down your cheek. Your heartbeats sound like Sasquatch feet, thundering, shaking the concrete. So far, all the examples we've seen have had line breaks. We can even imagine the two words of Ali's poem organizing in the air: me, we. Poetry has a shape that we can usually recognize. Its line breaks help readers navigate the rhythms of a poem. But what if those line breaks disappeared? Would it lose its essence as a poem? Maybe not. Enter the prose poem. Prose poems use vivid images and wordplay, but are formatted like paragraphs. When we look at poetry less as a form and more as a concept, we can see the poetic all around us. Spiritual hymns, the speeches of orators like Martin Luther King Jr., JFK, and Winston Churchill, and surprising places like social media. In 2010, journalist Joanna Smith tweeted updates from the earthquake in Haiti. Was in B-room getting dressed when heard my name. Tremor. Ran outside through sliding door. All still now. Safe. Roosters crowing. Smith uses language in a way that is powerful, direct, and filled with vivid images. Compare her language to a haiku, the ancient Japanese poetic form that emphasizes bursts of brief intensity, with just 3 lines of 5, 7, and 5 syllables. The waters of poetry run wide and deep. Poetry has evolved over time, and perhaps now more than ever, the line between poetry, prose, song, and visual art has blurred. However, one thing has not changed. The word poetry actually began in verb form, coming from the ancient Greek poiesis, which means to create. Poets, like craftsmen, still work with the raw materials of the world to forge new understandings and comment on what it is to be human in a way only humans can. Dartmouth researchers tested this idea by asking robots to pen poetry. A panel of judges sorted through stacks of sonnets to see if they could distinguish those made by man and machine. You may be happy to know that while scientists have successfully used artificial intelligence in manufacturing, medicine, and even journalism, poetry is a different story. The robots were caught red-handed 100% of the time.
Okay, so we've watched the video, the TED Talk there. I thought that was, I think it really is fascinating, the different angles of poetry that come up. But obviously they talk a little bit about song lyrics. So what I'd like you to do now is just pause this video and go to the Google form, go to the answer sheet, and write down your favourite line from any song, and also to write down why it's your favourite. Okay, so now you've done that, you're going to watch, we're going to see a variety of texts over the next few slides. Now, each text, I want you to pause. I want you to go back to the Google form and write down whether you think it's poetry or not. So we've watched that video all about those kind of different forms and different ideas, and whether poetry is, thinking back to Harry Potter and the Sorting Hat, is poetry more of a state of mind than it is anything else? Go back to the Google form and type in whether or not you think it's poetry. So, said Hamlet to Ophelia, I'll draw a sketch of thee. What kind of pencil shall I use, to be or not to be? So hopefully you paused all of those. Remember that there are 5 different texts. If you've missed them, go back and have a look. What we're going to do now is we're going to go through the text and see where they're from. Now, what I really want to make clear is that this doesn't make your answers right or wrong. We're just looking at what the original source was and kind of how far removed from poetry that source originally was, and whether or not we're surprised by the author or the creator or the form or indeed the title. So the first one is called A Silly Poem. That's its title. It's by Spike Milligan, who's a comedian. He was in some films, he wrote books, he wrote poetry, but he was largely associated with comedy. And this is called A Silly Poem. So this is the first verse of a song called Hero of War by a band called Rise Against, and they write very kind of political music, very political lyrics, and this is written in response to the Iraq War, and it's about joining the military in the States, and it's particularly about how the military in America often target young men who are sort of failing in their exams, and they try and get them in with kind of promises of things that are other than the reality of what they're going to face. These are some paintings by an artist called David Shrigley. He also makes films. He has on occasion, I think there's a record that came with one of his collections as well, but generally he makes these sort of large paintings. They're published in a variety of books, but he also has got some videos. So if you found these funny, then I would go onto YouTube and type David Shrigley and you'll find some very funny videos. This is from Young Forever by Nicki Minaj. I can't pretend that I know the song or did know the song before I found these lyrics, but I always think Nicki Minaj gives us a wealth of interesting words. And then finally, this is the end. This is the last paragraph of Nicola Sturgeon's speech to the Scottish Parliament. This is March 2020, so this is very recent. And this was the last paragraph of her speech. Now, this was the speech where they sort of realised that sort of we were heading down the lockdown route. So it's this is quite a historic speech, quite a historic moment. Okay, so we've watched the video. We've looked at the different texts, we've written down what we would expect in poetry, and we've written down why we like certain lines. What I want you to do now is go back to the Google form, and I want you to write down what I'm calling your first definition of poetry. So what you say poetry is now, at this point where we are. It might be at the end that your definition is very similar. It might be at the end, by the end of this video and by the end of filling out your Google form, you've got a completely different idea. But this is our sort of stopping point first up, writing down our first definition of what poetry is. So let's look again at those questions from the beginning. So these were the questions that we had. Why do we study it? What's the point of it? Are there any rules? Why do people write it? So we've sort of talked a bit about what poetry is, and we're beginning to have our own idea. Now, I don't know what your ideas are. We haven't been able to share them with each other yet. So we've all got our very own personal kind of individual ideas. We've been exposed to other people's through that video and through some of the pieces of writing that we've looked at. But we're still kind of very, very much on our own in that regard. So this is the bit that we're going to look at here. This thing of there being rules. This is the section we're going to look at. We're going to look at some more texts. We're going to look at some different texts now. Some of them are from some quite strange, some quite alternative sources that I've thought of. So we'll see how this goes. But there's going to be a transform instruction. So there's going to be an instruction underneath the text that's telling you to somehow change the text that you've got there. Your Google form has got corresponding sections on it, so make sure that you're up to the right place in your Google form, the right section. This is the sort of the transform section. So there's going to be a clear instruction on each slide. So if you pause it, work your way through it, and then just unpause the video to move to the next one. So this is a poem by Robert Frost, and I want you to turn this into a descriptive paragraph. So feel free to use the same words. Think about the different imagery you could use, the different metaphors, the different similes. Think about how you could, use that use what you've got there, but to turn this poem into a descriptive paragraph. Okay, so here is a weather report. What I would like you to do is to take this weather report from the UK from last week, and I would like you to turn it into a 5-word poem. You can interpret that term 5-word poem in any way you like, but I want you to take the weather report and turn it into a 5-word poem. Take as long as you like to do that. So now what I want you to do is take this painting by the very talented Georgia O'Keeffe. Take this painting and turn it into 3 lines of poetry. 3 lines of poetry. So we did 5 words and now we're on 3 lines of poetry. Okay, so we've sort of talked then about what poetry is. We talked about what poetry is in a kind of idealistic sense, in a literal sense in terms of rules, and then we've kind of had a look at how to make it ourselves over these last 3 slides. But by now you will all have your own ideas on what poetry is. So I want you to go back to the Google form. There's a section entitled What Poetry Is For. Now, bearing in mind all of the things that we've previously looked at, I want you to think about how you rank these statements. So there are some statements there, and you need to put them in. You need to put them in the sort of the right rank order from 1 to 5. So you need to say what you think the sort of the right one is, down to the least right one or the least accurate one. Okay, so let's pause now and think about what we've already looked at. We've looked at what poetry is. You've come up with your own ideas for what poetry is. We've watched the TED Talk. Whether or not something is poetry. We've looked at some different texts. We've decided whether or not something is poetry, and how to recognise and change it. So you've had a go at transforming something into a poem, and we have also come up with our own priorities for what poetry is for. So we've looked at in different ways what poetry is, whether or not something is poetry, how we recognise it, how we change it, and what it's for. So now we need to start having a look at why we study it and what the point of it is, whether or not we actually need it. So here is there's a section now on the Google form where you need to write an argument in response to a statement. So there's a statement about poetry in the next section of the Google form, and I want you to write a response to that statement. You can take as long as you need to complete that section. Okay, so we've gone through all of those kind of big questions that we looked at the start. Here's what we're going to do now. This is your task from 1 week to the next. This is your big task. You need to create something that shows what poetry means to you. Now, when I say something, I mean you could make a poem. You could make a podcast, you could make a drawing, you could make a slideshow, you could make a picture, you could make an essay, you could write a song. I don't mind. The format is not as important as the thought that has gone into it. You could include in any of those formats, you could include your own poetry, your favourite lines of poetry, your favourite song, you could include a painting, you could include different colours, you could include a speech. But the big thing that we have to have, the thing that we really need and we really want to see, is what your own definition of poetry is and your own reasons why we need poetry. What is poetry for? What is the point of it? Why are people writing it, and what is it? There's no right or wrong to this at all. This isn't about right or wrong. This is about you taking all of those big questions that we've had a look at and we've sort of slightly unpicked together, and you coming up with your own answers for those. So hopefully this has been useful. Hopefully this has been clear and relatively easy to follow. So please, as I say, give us some feedback. Let us know what works. Let us know what we could improve on for next week. But I hope that this worked very well, and I look forward to reading all your answers in the Google Forms. Okay, thank you very much, Year 9.